You're standing on a dock at twilight, watching the last light fade from the horizon. The water stretches endlessly before you, dark and unknowable. Somewhere out there, beneath those waves, lie the answers to questions that have haunted us for centuries. Ships that sailed into the sunset and never returned. Crews that vanished from vessels found drifting, perfectly intact. Messages that promised terror, then silence. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore history's most intriguing mysteries, designed to ease you gently into sleep. Tonight, we're setting sail into some of the strangest maritime disappearances ever recorded. From ghost ships found with meals still warm on the table to entire crews that vanished without sending a single distress call, we'll explore 10 cases where the sea claimed something and never gave it back. So settle into your most comfortable position. Let the day's worries drift away like messages in bottles, and join me as we journey across centuries of maritime mysteries. Our first story takes us to the cold waters off North Carolina in 1921, where a beautiful 5-masted schooner was found abandoned on the treacherous Diamond Shoals, her sails still set, her crew simply gone. The lighthouse keeper at Cape Lookout, North Carolina, noticed something odd on the morning of January 31, 1921. A large sailing vessel was grounded on the Diamond Shoals, that notorious stretch of shifting sandbars off Cape Hatteras known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The ship appeared intact, and through his telescope, the keeper could see her sails were still set, suggesting she'd run aground under full canvas. But something felt wrong. No distress signals, no signs of crew attempting to free the vessel, just an eerie stillness. Bad weather prevented anyone from reaching the ship for several days. When the Coast Guard finally boarded the Carroll A Deering on February 4th, they found a scene that would become one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. The ship was completely abandoned. Every member of the crew had vanished. But it was the details that made this disappearance so unsettling. The galley showed evidence of meal preparation. Food was laid out, cooking pots sat on the stove. The crew's personal belongings remained in their quarters. Navigation equipment was missing, along with the ship's chronometer, sextant, and logs. Both lifeboats were gone. In the captain's quarters, investigators found maps spread on the table, as if someone had been plotting a course. Everything suggested a hasty but deliberate abandonment. Yet there were no obvious signs of why the crew would leave a seaworthy vessel. Let's understand who these people were and how they came to be on this doomed voyage. The Carroll A Deering was a beautiful 5-masted commercial schooner built in Bath, Maine in 1919. She was named after the son of her owner, and at 255 feet long with 5 towering masts, she was an impressive sight under sail. These massive schooners represented the end of an era, majestic sailing vessels being gradually replaced by steam-powered ships, but still capable of carrying large cargoes economically. The ship's original captain, William Merritt, had set sail from Norfolk, Virginia in August 1920, bound for Rio de Janeiro with a cargo of coal. Captain Merritt was an experienced sailor, but he fell ill during the voyage south. In Rio, he was replaced by Captain Willis Wormel, a 66-year-old veteran of the seas who came out of retirement for this voyage. Wormel brought along his son as first mate. The crew that sailed north from Rio in December 1920 numbered 11 men, though their names and backgrounds remain somewhat unclear in historical records. What we do know is that there was tension aboard. Before leaving Barbados on their final leg home, Captain Wormel reportedly complained to friends that his crew was troublesome, and that he particularly distrusted his first mate, a man named McClellan. He even mentioned fear of mutiny. A few days before the Deering was found abandoned, several witnesses reported seeing the ship and speaking with crew members, and these encounters have only deepened the mystery. On January 28th, the Deering passed the Cape Fear lightship off North Carolina. A man on the Deering's deck called out to the lightship crew, saying they'd lost both anchors and asking the lightship to report this when they reached shore. The man appeared to be the first mate, but something seemed off. The lightship keeper later testified that the man seemed to be giving orders to the captain, which was highly unusual. He also noted that the crew appeared to be milling about on deck in an unorganized way, unlike a well-run ship. This sighting has fueled speculation about mutiny. Was McClellan already in control of the ship? Had the crew overthrown Captain Wormel? But if so, why would they continue sailing toward home waters where they'd certainly be caught? 2 days later, on January 29th, the Deering was spotted by the Cape Lookout lightship, still under sail and appearing to be making for port. Then, sometime in the next 24 to 36 hours, the ship grounded on Diamond Shoals and the crew vanished. When investigators examined the grounded vessel more thoroughly, they found troubling details. The ship's compass had been smashed. The ship's bell was missing. Red lights that should have been part of the running lights were found in odd locations. Some cargo had been removed from the hold. Yet there was no evidence of violence, no blood, no signs of struggle. The theories that emerged were varied and increasingly elaborate. The mutiny theory seemed most obvious given Captain Wormel's pre-voyage concerns. Perhaps the crew had rebelled, killed the captain and his son, then fled in the lifeboats before the ship grounded. But this raises questions. Experienced sailors would have known that abandoning ship in lifeboats off the treacherous Diamond Shoals was nearly suicidal. If they'd successfully taken control of the ship, why not simply sail her to a remote port and disappear? Piracy was another early theory. The early 1920s saw increased pirate activity in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast, often involving rum runners and criminals taking advantage of prohibition. Perhaps pirates boarded the Deering, killed the crew, looted the ship, and fled when she ran aground. But pirates would typically take a valuable cargo ship intact, not abandon it. And why would they leave so much behind? The timing of the Deering's disappearance coincided with several other mysterious ship vanishings in the same general area, leading some to suspect organized criminal activity. In the same period, 9 other vessels were lost under strange circumstances in the Western Atlantic, including the USS Cyclops, which we'll discuss later. The State Department became involved, suspecting possible Soviet activity. These were the early days of Cold War tensions, and some officials theorized that Bolshevik agents might be hijacking American ships. Weather seemed an unlikely explanation. While the Diamond Shoals are dangerous, the Deering appeared to have run aground under control, with sails set. If sudden storms had endangered the ship, there would have been damage, torn rigging, signs of the vessel being battered. Instead, she looked almost peacefully placed on the shoals. The most haunting theory involves the idea that something happened to the crew before the ship grounded. Some researchers have speculated about mass food poisoning or illness that might have caused delirium, leading the crew to abandon ship irrationally. But this seems unlikely given the organized nature of the abandonment. Someone took navigation equipment, lowered lifeboats properly, and left the ship in relatively good order. In 1922, a bottle washed ashore near Cape Hatteras, containing a note allegedly written by the Deering's engineer. DERING captured by oil-burning boat something like chaser. Taking off everything, handcuffing crew. Crew hiding all over ship, no chance to make escape. Finder please notify headquarters Deering. This message created enormous interest, but handwriting analysis proved inconclusive, and many suspected it was a hoax by someone seeking reward money. Over the following years, occasional reports surfaced of crew members supposedly spotted in various ports, or of deathbed confessions from pirates claiming to have attacked the Deering. None were verified. The official investigation, one of the most extensive maritime inquiries of its time, concluded in 1922 without determining what happened. The report essentially said that the crew had disappeared and the cause was unknown. What makes the Carroll A. Deering case so compelling is its perfect ambiguity. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence contradicting it. The ship tells us the crew left in a hurry but took time to gather navigation equipment. The earlier sightings suggest either mutiny or normalcy, depending on interpretation. The missing captain's logs mean we'll never know what was happening aboard in those final days. The Carroll A. Deering was eventually broken up where she lay on Diamond Shoals, her timbers scattered by storms, her beautiful masts toppled by wind and waves. But the mystery of her crew persists, one of the great unsolved cases of American maritime history. 11 men sailed toward home and simply vanished, leaving behind a ghost ship that has haunted the imagination for over a century. This story begins with a distress call, picked up by multiple ships and coastal radio stations in the Straits of Malacca, sometime in June 1947. The exact date remains unclear, which is our first hint that this case exists in a strange gray area between documented history and maritime legend. The message was chilling, fragmentary, transmitted in Morse code by someone clearly in distress. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. This was followed by indecipherable Morse, then one final clear message: I die. Then silence. The distress call provided coordinates and identified the vessel as the Ourang Medan, a Dutch freighter. 2 American vessels, the Silver Star and another ship, changed course to respond to the emergency. The Silver Star, being closer, reached the Ourang Medan first. What the crew found would become one of the most disturbing maritime mysteries ever recorded, if it really happened. The Ourang Medan was drifting in the strait, apparently intact. There was no visible damage to the hull, no fire, no signs of collision or storm damage. The Silver Star crew hailed the vessel repeatedly, but received no response. Following maritime protocol, they launched a boat and boarded the silent ship. The scene they discovered was like something from a nightmare. Bodies were scattered throughout the ship, on the bridge, in the chart room, on the deck, in the corridor. Every single member of the crew was dead, but it was the manner of their deaths that made this discovery so disturbing. According to accounts, the bodies were found in grotesque poses, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and terror. Eyes staring wide, mouths agape, arms outstretched as if defending against some invisible threat, or reaching toward something only they could see. The ship's dog was found dead, its teeth bared in a snarl. Even the bodies in locked rooms showed these same expressions of terror. The boarding party from the Silver Star reported feeling an intense cold in the rooms below deck, despite the tropical heat. Some accounts mention that the bodies showed no signs of injury. No bullet wounds, no knife marks, no obvious cause of death. They had simply died, all at once or in rapid succession, in apparent terror. The crew of the Silver Star began preparing to tow the Ourang Medan to port so authorities could investigate. But before they could secure the tow line, smoke began rising from one of the cargo holds. Within minutes, fire erupted throughout the ship. The boarding party barely had time to return to the Silver Star before the Ourang Medan exploded with such force that she lifted clear of the water. The ship sank rapidly, taking all the bodies and any evidence of what had happened to the bottom of the strait. This is the story as it's been told and retold since the late 1940s. It's appeared in books, magazines, television programs, and countless internet discussions. It's one of the most famous maritime mysteries of the 20th century. There's just one problem: we have no definitive proof it actually happened. Researchers investigating the Ourang Medan have found nothing. No registration records for a Dutch ship by that name. No newspaper accounts from 1947, despite this being exactly the kind of sensational story newspapers would have covered extensively. No official investigation reports. No interviews with Silver Star crew members. The Lloyd's shipping register, which meticulously documented virtually every commercial vessel of the era, contains no mention of the Ourang Medan. The story seems to have first appeared in print in 1948 in Dutch and German publications, then was picked up by English-language sources. But these accounts differ in details. The date varies, the number of crew members changes. Some versions include survivors who went mad. Other versions say everyone died instantly. This variation suggests a story that's being passed along and embellished rather than documented fact. So is the Ourang Medan entirely fictional? Some researchers believe it was a hoax, perhaps inspired by real maritime disasters, but elaborated into something more sensational. The tale has all the elements of a good maritime horror story. The cryptic distress call, the ship of corpses with terrified expressions, the mysterious explosion that destroys all evidence. It's almost too perfect, too literary. But others argue that absence of records doesn't prove the incident never happened. The Straits of Malacca in 1947 were chaotic waters. World War II had ended just 2 years earlier, and the region was in transition from colonial rule. Many ships operated with irregular documentation. If the Ourang Medan was engaged in some kind of illegal activity, smuggling, arms running, transporting dangerous cargo, it might have been deliberately unregistered or registered under a different name. This brings us to one of the more plausible theories about what the Ourang Medan might have been doing. Some researchers have proposed that the ship was transporting chemical weapons or dangerous materials left over from the Japanese occupation of Indonesia during World War II. Japan had chemical warfare programs in the region, and after the war, there were dangerous materials that needed to be disposed of or moved. If the Ourang Medan was carrying such cargo, perhaps nerve agents, toxic chemicals, or other hazardous materials, an accident could have killed the crew rapidly. This theory would explain the expressions of agony if the crew died from chemical poisoning. It would explain the cold temperatures reported below deck if the cargo included materials stored in a refrigerated hold. It would explain why the ship exploded and sank so quickly if volatile or reactive materials were aboard. And it would certainly explain why there are no official records. Governments don't document ships carrying illegal chemical weapons. Another theory suggests carbon monoxide poisoning, perhaps from a faulty boiler or fire in a cargo hold. Carbon monoxide can kill quickly, and victims might exhibit the kind of distress described in the accounts before losing consciousness. But this doesn't explain the reported cold temperatures, or why the ship would explode so dramatically. The Soviet connection has also been proposed. In 1947, the Cold War was beginning, and there were concerns about Soviet activities in Southeast Asian waters. Some have theorized that the Ourang Medan might have been a Soviet vessel, or might have encountered Soviet forces who killed the crew. But again, there's no evidence, and it seems unlikely that such an incident would go completely undocumented. Skeptics point out that many elements of the Ourang Medan story appear in earlier maritime fiction and legends. The trope of the ghost ship with a dead crew in grotesque poses appears in stories dating back to the 1800s. The exploding ship that destroys all evidence is a convenient literary device that prevents investigation. The whole narrative follows the structure of a ghost story rather than a documented disaster. What we're left with is a mystery that might be a mystery about whether there ever was a mystery. The Ourang Medan might be entirely fictional, a maritime urban legend that grew in the telling. Or it might be a real incident that occurred outside official channels, its records lost or deliberately suppressed, the details distorted by time and retelling. The lack of corroborating evidence doesn't definitively prove it never happened, but it certainly raises significant doubts. The story of the Ourang Medan has become a kind of Rorschach test for maritime mystery enthusiasts. Believers see it as evidence that the ocean holds secrets too strange and terrible for official records. Skeptics see it as a cautionary tale about accepting dramatic stories without verification. The truth, assuming there is one, likely lies somewhere in those dark waters between legend and history, where so many maritime mysteries dwell. October 1917. The First World War was raging, and the waters around Britain were among the most dangerous on Earth. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, hunting merchant ships that supplied the British war effort. Every voyage was potentially fatal, and ships moved in convoys when possible, zigzagging to avoid torpedo attacks. In this context of constant danger, the mystery of the Zebrina unfolded. The Zebrina was a schooner, one of hundreds of similar vessels that moved cargo around Britain's coast during the war. She was a working ship, nothing fancy, built to carry coal, stone, and other bulk goods from port to port. In October 1917, she was loaded with coal in Falmouth, on England's southwest coast, and set sail for St. Brieuc in Brittany, France. The journey should have taken a few days. The crew consisted of experienced sailors who knew these waters well. The Zebrina never arrived at St. Brieuc. Instead, on October 17, 1917, French coastal patrol found her grounded on the Roches d'Ouvres Reef, a dangerous rocky outcrop off the coast of Brittany. The ship was upright, apparently undamaged. Her sails were still set. The cargo of coal was secure in the hold, but the crew was gone, all of them, simply vanished. When investigators boarded the Zebrina, they found a scene both ordinary and deeply unsettling. The ship's boats were still in their davits. The crew hadn't left in lifeboats. The crew's personal belongings remained in their quarters. There was no evidence of fire, explosion, or damage from gunfire. No signs of struggle. The deck was neat, the rigging properly secured. It was as if the crew had simply stepped off the ship and disappeared into thin air. The most peculiar detail was the condition of the ship itself. For a vessel that had run aground on rocks, the Zebrina showed remarkably little damage. She was sitting upright, securely grounded but not broken apart. This suggested that she might have been deliberately grounded rather than accidentally wrecked in a storm. But why would a crew deliberately ground their ship on dangerous rocks and then vanish without a trace? The wartime context naturally led to theories about German U-boats. Perhaps a U-boat had surfaced, captured the crew, and taken them as prisoners of war. This happened occasionally during the conflict. U-boat captains would board merchant ships, remove the crew, and either sink the vessel or leave it disabled. But there were problems with this theory. U-boats operating in these waters typically torpedoed ships rather than boarding them, as surfacing made submarines vulnerable to attack. And if Germans had boarded the Zebrina, they would likely have sunk her, or at least damaged her enough to prevent use by the British. Moreover, German records from the period, examined after the war, showed no mention of U-boats in that specific area on those dates, and no record of prisoners taken from the Zebrina. While German documentation wasn't always complete, the absence of any reference to this capture is notable. Weather presented another possible explanation. October in the English Channel and approaches to the Bay of Biscay can bring sudden, violent storms. Perhaps the Zebrina had been caught in severe weather. The crew had taken to lifeboats thinking the ship was about to break apart, and those lifeboats had been lost, while the ship itself drifted to the reef and survived intact. This scenario, while plausible, has several weaknesses. First, the sails were still set, suggesting the ship had been under control rather than being battered by storms. Second, experienced sailors wouldn't abandon a ship that was still seaworthy in favor of lifeboats in storm conditions. Boats are much more vulnerable than ships in rough seas. Some accounts of the Zebrina mystery mention that unusual weather patterns were reported in the area around the time of the disappearance. There were reports of strange fogs, sudden calm seas, and peculiar atmospheric conditions. Whether these reports are reliable or were added later to enhance the mystery is difficult to determine. Wartime records from this period are incomplete, and maritime weather documentation was less comprehensive than it became later. The possibility of piracy has been suggested, though it seems unlikely. Piracy in European waters was rare by 1917, and pirates would typically take the ship itself or its cargo rather than just the crew. The coal remained in the hold, valuable wartime commodity that pirates would certainly have wanted. The ship itself was valuable. Why would pirates take only the crew and leave everything else? A darker theory involves possible murder-suicide or mutiny gone wrong. Perhaps something happened aboard. A disagreement between crew members, a mental breakdown, some interpersonal conflict that escalated to violence. But this doesn't explain the lack of bodies or blood. If the crew had been killed, where were they? If they'd killed each other and disposed of bodies overboard, why was there no evidence of violence on the ship? The theory that perhaps comes closest to explaining the known facts is a tragic accident involving the lifeboats. If the crew had seen what they believed was an approaching U-boat, they might have launched lifeboats in panic, intending to hide in them until the danger passed or to row to shore. The Zebrina, under sail with no one at the helm, might have continued on until she grounded on the reef. Meanwhile, the crew in their lifeboats could have been swamped by waves, swept out to sea, or otherwise lost. Bodies lost at sea often remain lost, especially in wartime when dedicated search efforts were limited. This scenario requires several unfortunate circumstances to align. The crew had to misidentify something as a U-boat threat. They had to choose to abandon ship rather than trying to evade. Their lifeboats had to be lost without any wreckage washing ashore, and the Zebrina had to drift precisely to the reef where she was found. It's not impossible, but it requires a chain of bad luck. What makes the Zebrina particularly haunting is that it occurred during a time when so many ships and sailors were being lost, that one more mysterious disappearance might have seemed almost unremarkable. The First World War saw merchant shipping losses on a massive scale. Thousands of sailors died when their vessels were torpedoed, mined, or caught in storms. The Zebrina's crew might have been just another casualty list in a war full of them, except for the strange circumstances of their disappearance. The ship itself was eventually refloated and put back into service. She continued working for years afterward, carrying cargo around Britain's coasts, eventually ending her days in more peaceful waters. But the mystery of what happened to her crew in October 1917 was never solved. They simply vanished, leaving behind only an empty ship with set sails and an untouched cargo of coal. On November 10, 1955, the merchant vessel Joyita departed Samoa's Apia harbor on what should have been a routine 48-hour voyage to the Tokelau Islands, about 270 miles to the north. She was carrying 16 crew members and 9 passengers, 25 people in total, along with cargo that included medical supplies, timber, empty oil drums, and other goods. The ship was expected to arrive in Tokelau on November 12th. She never made it. 5 weeks later, on November 10, another merchant vessel spotted something strange drifting in the ocean, about 600 miles from where the Joyita had last been seen. It was the Joyita herself, wallowing in the swells, listing heavily to port, her decks awash. But she was afloat, despite appearing to be a waterlogged wreck, and she was completely abandoned. All 25 people had vanished. The discovery of the Joyita triggered one of the most extensive maritime investigations in the South Pacific's history, and what investigators found only deepened the mystery. The ship was in terrible condition, but crucially, she was unsinkable. The Joyita had been specifically modified with cork insulation lining her hull, designed to keep her afloat even if completely flooded. This cork lining meant that no matter how much water got into the ship, she would stay on the surface. The passengers and crew would have known this, so why did they abandon a ship that couldn't sink? Let's understand the Joyita and her captain. The ship was a 70-foot wooden-hulled motor vessel built in 1931 in Los Angeles. She'd originally been a luxury yacht before being converted to a merchant vessel. By 1955, she was showing her age. The hull needed maintenance, some equipment was worn, and she'd experienced mechanical problems on previous voyages. She wasn't a pristine ship, but she was serviceable, and had made the Samoa-Tokelau run before. The captain was Thomas "Dusty" Miller, an American who'd been living in Samoa and running charter operations. Miller was an experienced sailor, though his business had struggled financially. This particular voyage was important for him. He'd contracted to deliver the cargo and needed the money. He'd brought his wife aboard as a passenger, which he wouldn't have done if he'd expected serious problems. When investigators boarded the derelict Joyita, they found a scene that was both orderly and chaotic. The ship's deck was littered with debris. Some of the cargo remained, but much appeared to have been removed or washed away. 3 life rafts were missing. The Joyita had carried 3, and all were gone, suggesting the crew and passengers had deliberately abandoned ship using the rafts. But strangely, other survival equipment remained on board, including working life jackets. Below deck, the conditions were revealing. The engine room was flooded, and one of the ship's 2 engines had its clutch disassembled, suggesting it had broken down during the voyage. The working engine's cooling system had apparently failed, which would have caused overheating. The bilge pumps weren't working properly, so the Joyita had been taking on water with no way to pump it out effectively and with limited engine power. Several details on the abandoned ship were particularly curious. A doctor's bag was found open, with medical supplies scattered around, including blood-stained bandages. This suggested someone had been injured and received medical treatment. Several other items were blood-stained, though not with amounts suggesting serious violence. More like someone with a head wound or similar injury had bled onto various surfaces. The ship's log and navigation equipment were missing. The radio was tuned to the international distress frequency and set to transmit, though it had a wiring problem that would have limited its range to about 2 miles. An awning had been rigged on deck, suggesting the crew might have been trying to provide shade for survivors or injured people. Electric cables had been jury-rigged to power some equipment that usually ran on battery. Perhaps most mysteriously, the ship's clocks had all stopped at 10:25, though whether AM or PM or on which day couldn't be determined. The official investigation, led by maritime authorities and the Royal New Zealand Navy, examined numerous theories. The most straightforward explanation was that the ship had been sinking. The crew had panicked and abandoned ship in the life rafts, and those rafts had been lost in rough seas. But this theory had problems. First, the Joyita couldn't sink. The cork lining would keep her afloat indefinitely, and Captain Miller knew this. Second, abandoning a partially flooded ship for small life rafts in the open ocean is extraordinarily dangerous. Experienced sailors know that you should stay with the ship as long as possible, because ships, even damaged ones, are much more visible to rescuers than tiny life rafts. Weather records showed that seas had been moderate in the area, nothing that would make an experienced captain abandon ship. The Joyita, even listing and partially flooded, was still a much safer place to be than life rafts on the open Pacific. Piracy was seriously considered. The South Pacific in the 1950s had some pirate activity, particularly around remote island groups. Perhaps pirates had attacked the Joyita, taken the crew and passengers as hostages or killed them, looted what cargo they wanted, and left the ship to drift. The bloodstains could support this theory. But the pirates would have had to arrive in their own vessel, and no other ships were reported in the area. And why would pirates leave so much cargo behind, including valuable medical supplies? The Japanese fishing fleet theory emerged because large Japanese fishing vessels operated in these waters, sometimes illegally near island territories. Some speculated that the Joyita might have witnessed illegal fishing activity, and the Japanese fishermen might have captured the crew to prevent them from reporting the violation. This theory was investigated, but no evidence supported it. and Japanese fishing companies denied any involvement. A more mundane but possibly more plausible theory involves mechanical failure leading to a different kind of accident. With one engine out, the cooling system failing, water flooding the engine room, and the pumps not working, the Joyita would have been in serious trouble even if she couldn't sink. The flooding might have released fumes, gasoline, diesel, or battery acid, that made the below-deck areas uninhabitable. If someone had been seriously injured during the mechanical crisis, and if the crew had been unable to radio for help effectively, Captain Miller might have made the difficult decision to abandon ship. Here's a possible scenario that fits many of the facts. The Joyita's engine breaks down, and while the crew is working to repair it, the cooling system fails on the remaining engine. The ship begins taking on water faster than the faulty pumps can handle. During the emergency, someone is injured, perhaps in the engine room, perhaps on deck in rough seas. The doctor treats them, creating the blood-stained bandages. Captain Miller realizes they can't repair the ship at sea and can't radio for help because the radio's range is too limited. He makes the decision to abandon ship in the life rafts, planning to row to one of the nearby islands. But in the Pacific, nearby can still mean dozens of miles. The life rafts, perhaps damaged or inadequate for the conditions, fail. Everyone perishes at sea. Meanwhile, the Joyita, true to her cork-line design, doesn't sink. She drifts for weeks until found. This scenario requires the captain to make what seems like a poor decision, abandoning an unsinkable ship. But decision-making in emergencies, especially with injured people, flooding, and failed equipment, doesn't always follow perfect logic. If Miller believed the flooding was getting worse, and that toxic fumes or other dangers made staying aboard untenable, he might have chosen to take his chances with the life rafts. The mystery deepened when pieces of life rafts washed ashore on various islands over the following years. Some were confirmed to be from the Joyita. This proved the rafts had been used, but didn't explain what happened to the 25 people who should have been in them. The Joyita herself was eventually refloated and sold. She continued working in the Pacific for several more years before finally being laid up and scrapped. But the mystery of what happened to her passengers and crew was never definitively solved. The official inquiry concluded that the evidence was insufficient to determine what occurred. 25 people had vanished from an unsinkable ship in moderate seas, and despite one of the most thorough maritime investigations of its time, no one could explain why. On April 15, 2007, 3 friends set out from Airlie Beach in Queensland, Australia, on what should have been an enjoyable sailing trip. Derek Batten, aged 56, his brother Peter Tunstead, 69, and their friend James Tunstead, 63, were all experienced sailors embarking on a leisurely cruise up the northeastern Australian coast. They were sailing the Kaz II, a 40-foot catamaran, and planned to take their time, enjoying the beautiful weather and the spectacular scenery of the Great Barrier Reef region. The 3 men were well prepared. The Kaz II was a modern, well-maintained vessel equipped with all necessary safety equipment and modern navigation electronics. The weather forecast was favorable. The waters they'd be sailing, while requiring respect, weren't unusually dangerous. Everything seemed routine. They expected to arrive at Townsville within a couple of weeks. 2 days later, on April 18th, a helicopter crew conducting regular coastal surveillance spotted something odd. A catamaran was sailing northeast of Townsville, apparently under power from its engine, moving at about 3 knots. But there was no one at the helm, no one visible on deck. The boat was simply sailing itself. The helicopter crew radioed authorities, and the Coast Guard dispatched a vessel to investigate. When the Coast Guard reached the Kaz II and boarded her, they found a scene that would become one of Australia's most baffling modern maritime mysteries. The boat was in near-perfect condition. The engine was running. The computers were on. The radio was working and properly tuned. A laptop was still operating, showing weather conditions. The table was set for a meal. Fishing lines were deployed off the stern. The men's personal belongings were all aboard. Wallets, mobile phones, and 3 life jackets, all accounted for. But Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead, and James Tunstead were gone. All 3 men had simply vanished. The details of the scene were particularly haunting because everything suggested normalcy interrupted mid-action. One of the boat's fenders, cushions that hang over the side to prevent damage when docking, was deployed, which was odd for a boat underway in open water. The emergency positioning beacon, which should have been activated if the crew abandoned ship, hadn't been touched. The life raft was still secured in its place. Most strangely, the boat's emergency systems had never been activated, suggesting the men hadn't even tried to call for help. The investigation that followed was extensive and detailed. Australian maritime authorities conducted searches covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Aircraft, boats, and coastal patrols looked for any sign of the 3 men or clues to what might have happened. Nothing was found. No bodies, no debris, no evidence of the men anywhere in the water or on nearby shores. Investigators examined every inch of the Kaz II, looking for evidence of what might have caused 3 experienced sailors to vanish from a perfectly functioning boat in calm seas. The forensic examination found no signs of violence, no blood, no damage to the vessel that would suggest collision or accident. The boat's systems were working normally. There was fuel in the tanks, food in the galley, everything in order. One crucial clue emerged from examining the boat's sail configuration. The Kaz II's headsail, the sail at the front of the boat, had been shredded and was trailing in the water. This is important because it suggests something might have gone wrong with the sail, requiring the crew to deal with it. If the sail had gotten tangled or torn, experienced sailors would need to either secure it or possibly go into the water to free it from the propeller if it had wrapped around the prop. The investigation's final report, released in 2008, proposed what they believed was the most likely scenario based on the evidence. The headsail had become damaged or fouled, probably catching on something or wrapping in a way that made it difficult to manage from the deck. One of the men, likely Derek Batten, who owned the boat, went over the side to free it or assess the problem. He may have tied himself to the boat or thought the short task didn't require a safety line. Here's where the tragedy likely began. Catamarans are stable platforms, but they sit relatively high in the water, making it difficult for someone in the ocean to climb back aboard without a proper ladder. If Batten had gone over the side without deploying the boat's swim ladder, he might have found himself unable to get back on board. His 2 companions, seeing him in trouble, would have immediately tried to help. Perhaps one jumped in to assist, then the 3rd followed, or they attempted to reach him with ropes and poles but ended up in the water themselves. Once all 3 men were in the water, they would have faced a catastrophic situation. The Kaz II, with its engine still running and set on autopilot, would have continued moving away from them. Catamarans are fast, and even at 3 knots, the boat would quickly outpace swimmers. Within minutes, the vessel would have been too far away to reach. The men would have been left treading water, watching their boat sail away with all their safety equipment, radios, and emergency beacons aboard. This scenario, as terrible as it is, explains many of the mystery's aspects. It explains why the boat was undamaged and all systems were running normally. It explains why none of the emergency equipment was activated. The emergency happened too quickly for anyone to reach it. It explains why all 3 men vanished. They were trying to help each other. It explains the deployed fender, which might have been lowered as an attempt to grab onto something or to help someone climb back aboard. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority's report concluded that this was the most probable explanation. Though they acknowledged it remained speculation based on available evidence. They couldn't prove this was what happened, but it fit the facts better than any alternative theory. What makes the Kaz II mystery particularly haunting is how modern it is. This didn't happen in the age of wooden ships and uncertain navigation. This occurred in 2007 with GPS, satellite communications, emergency beacons, and modern safety equipment. The boat had everything needed to prevent disaster or call for help. Except the men weren't on board to use any of it. The sea conditions on April 15th through 18th were documented as calm to moderate. There were no storms, no unusual weather events, no reports of dangerous sea conditions in the area. This was a routine coastal cruise in good weather. Yet 3 experienced sailors vanished without a trace in waters that thousands of people sail safely every year. The psychological impact of the Kaz II case rippled through Australia's sailing community. It highlighted how quickly maritime emergencies can develop and how important seemingly minor safety procedures are. The case led to renewed emphasis on always wearing safety harnesses when working near the sides of boats, ensuring swim ladders are deployed before anyone enters the water, and the importance of emergency cutoff switches that would stop the engine if crew members fall overboard. Some people have suggested more mysterious explanations. Could the men have encountered something unexpected? A large marine animal, perhaps. Shark attacks are extremely rare in those waters, and an attack on 3 men simultaneously would be unprecedented. Could there have been some kind of medical emergency, perhaps carbon monoxide poisoning from the engine, that affected all 3 men? But this doesn't explain why they would all leave the boat, and there was no evidence of exhaust gas in the cabin. A few theorists have proposed even more unlikely scenarios: that the men were abducted by another vessel, that they staged their disappearance, that they encountered something they couldn't explain. But these theories don't match the evidence. The boat showed no signs of another vessel coming alongside. The men's financial records gave no indication they were planning to disappear, and there was simply no evidence of anything unusual beyond the torn sail. The reality, as best as investigators could determine, is that 3 friends died in a tragic accident that took only minutes to unfold. A simple problem with a sail led to a desperate attempt to fix it, which led to someone going overboard, which led to attempts to rescue that person, which resulted in all 3 men in the water while their boat sailed away from them. They likely survived for some time, probably hours, treading water and swimming, perhaps trying to stay together, watching the horizon for rescue that never came. Eventually, exhaustion and exposure would have claimed them. The ocean, vast and indifferent, accepted them without leaving any trace. The Kaz II was eventually sold at auction and continues to sail under a different name with a different owner. But in Australia, she'll always be known as the ghost yacht, the modern mystery, the boat that sailed herself to shore while her crew vanished in calm seas on a beautiful autumn day. March 1918. The First World War was entering its final, brutal year. The Atlantic Ocean was a battlefield where German U-boats hunted Allied shipping with ruthless efficiency. Into these dangerous waters sailed the USS Cyclops, a massive United States Navy collier. A specialized cargo ship designed to carry coal to fuel the fleet. She was heading from Barbados to Baltimore, a voyage that should have taken about a week. The Cyclops never arrived. She simply vanished, taking with her 309 people in what remains the single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history not involving combat. The disappearance of the Cyclops is particularly baffling because she was a huge ship, over 540 feet long, weighing more than 19,000 tons when fully loaded. This wasn't a small vessel that could easily slip beneath the waves unnoticed. She was a massive steel presence on the ocean, equipped with radio, with lookouts, with experienced naval personnel. Yet she sent no distress signal, left no debris field, and provided no clue about what happened. 309 people simply ceased to exist somewhere between Barbados and Baltimore. Let's understand the ship and her voyage. The USS Cyclops was built in 1910 specifically to carry coal for the Navy's coal-burning warships. She had huge cargo holds that could transport over 10,000 tons of coal at a time. By 1918, she was an older vessel, and there had been concerns about her structural integrity. Some reports suggested she developed cracks in her hull during previous voyages, but she was still in service and considered seaworthy enough for regular operations. The captain of the Cyclops was Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, a German-born American who'd been in command for several years. Worley was an eccentric character, known for wearing long underwear and a derby hat while walking the deck, and for having a violent temper. Some crew members considered him erratic and difficult to work with. His German birth would later fuel speculation about his loyalty, though there was no evidence he was anything but a dedicated American naval officer. In early March 1918, the Cyclops was in Rio de Janeiro, where she loaded 11,000 tons of manganese ore, a critical material used in steel production for the war effort. Manganese ore is extremely dense and heavy, much heavier than the coal the Cyclops typically carried. This would become important to later theories about what happened. The ship departed Rio, stopped briefly in Bahia, Brazil, then continued to Barbados, arriving on March 3rd. In Barbados, Captain Worley reported that one of the ship's 2 engines had developed problems and was not functioning properly. The Cyclops would have to complete the journey to Baltimore on a single engine, reducing her speed significantly. This was concerning, but not considered dangerous enough to delay the voyage or call for escort. The Cyclops departed Barbados on March 4, 1918. She was never seen or heard from again. The ship was due in Baltimore by March 13th. When she failed to arrive, authorities initially weren't overly concerned. Delays due to mechanical problems, bad weather, or routing changes were common, especially during wartime. But as days turned into weeks with no word from the Cyclops, concern grew into alarm. The Navy launched an extensive search and investigation. They contacted ports along the eastern seaboard and throughout the Caribbean, checking if the Cyclops had diverted to any of them. They interviewed other ships that had been in the area during the relevant time period. They examined German naval records to see if any U-boats had reported attacking the vessel. They investigated every possible clue. They found nothing. The Cyclops had simply disappeared. The theories about what happened to the USS Cyclops have been numerous and varied, each with its own evidence and problems. Let's examine them carefully. The U-boat theory was the immediate assumption. German submarines were sinking Allied ships regularly in 1918, and a large, slow-moving American naval vessel would have been a tempting target. Perhaps a U-boat torpedoed the Cyclops, and she sank so quickly that no distress signal could be sent and no survivors escaped. This would explain the complete disappearance. However, German naval records captured after the war showed no U-boats claiming the Cyclops as a kill. U-boat commanders meticulously recorded their attacks. Sinking an American naval vessel would have been a significant achievement worth documenting. The lack of any German record of the attack argues against this theory, though its possible records were lost or incomplete. The structural failure theory suggests that the Cyclops, already weakened by cracks in her hull and overloaded with extremely heavy manganese ore, simply broke apart and sank. Ships can sink surprisingly quickly when structural failure occurs. The weight of cargo and water can pull a vessel down in minutes. If the Cyclops broke up and sank rapidly, this might explain the lack of distress signals and survivors. Supporting this theory is the fact that the Cyclops was carrying significantly more weight than she typically carried with coal, and manganese ore settles differently than coal, potentially creating uneven weight distribution. The ship was also operating on only one engine, which might have prevented her from maneuvering effectively if she encountered rough seas or problems. If the hull failed catastrophically, the ship could have gone down in minutes, giving the crew no time to launch lifeboats or send radio messages. The weather theory proposes that the Cyclops encountered an unusual storm or rough seas that overwhelmed the vessel. March in the Atlantic can bring severe weather, and ships have been lost to sudden storms throughout history, with only one functioning engine and possibly compromised structural integrity. The Cyclops might not have been able to handle heavy weather that a fully operational ship could have survived. But weather records from the period, while not comprehensive, don't show evidence of severe storms in the area during the time the Cyclops would have been transiting. Other ships made the same voyage during the same period without encountering weather severe enough to threaten a vessel of the Cyclops' size. A more sinister theory involves sabotage or mutiny. Captain Worley was unpopular with his crew, and his German birth made some people suspicious of his loyalty. Could Worley have deliberately taken the ship to a German rendezvous point, intending to turn the ship and cargo over to Germany? Could crew members, suspicious of their German-born captain during a war with Germany, have mutinied? These theories gained some traction at the time, fueled by wartime paranoia and anti-German sentiment. But these theories have significant problems. If Worley was a German agent, why wait until 1918 to betray his country after years of faithful service? And why would Germany want a broken-down collier when they needed submarines and warships? The mutiny theory doesn't explain what happened to the ship. Even if the crew overthrew Worley, they'd still need to take the ship somewhere, and there's no evidence it reached any port. One of the more recent theories involves the possibility of a rogue wave. An enormous, unexpected wave that could have capsized or severely damaged even a large ship. Rogue waves, once considered maritime myth, have been documented by modern science as real phenomena. A wave 60 or 70 feet high hitting the Cyclops, especially if she was compromised by structural problems or improper loading, might have been catastrophic. What makes the Cyclops mystery even more eerie is what happened to her sister ships. The Cyclops was one of 4 identical colliers built for the Navy. The other 3 were the Proteus, the Nereus, and the Jupiter. In 1941, both the Proteus and Nereus disappeared without a trace in the same general area of the Atlantic, the region that would later be called the Bermuda Triangle. Both ships were carrying heavy loads of metallic ore. Both vanished completely, just like their sister ship had in 1918. This pattern led some people to suggest that something about these particular ships made them vulnerable to whatever forces or conditions existed in that region. Were they structurally flawed in ways that made them susceptible to certain sea conditions? Did their design create instability when carrying certain types of cargo? Or was it simply tragic coincidence that 3 of 4 sister ships were lost? The Bermuda Triangle angle has naturally been applied to the Cyclops case, with theorists suggesting everything from magnetic anomalies to alien abduction to interdimensional portals. These supernatural explanations, while popular in certain circles, don't add much to our understanding. The Bermuda Triangle's reputation as a uniquely dangerous area isn't supported by statistical evidence. When you account for the volume of traffic through that region, the loss rate isn't higher than comparable areas of ocean. The most likely explanation, based on available evidence, is probably a combination of factors. The Cyclops was an aging ship with known structural problems. She was overloaded with cargo heavier than her normal load. She was operating on reduced power with only one engine. She may have encountered weather or sea conditions that, while not extreme enough to threaten most ships, were more than her compromised state could handle. She broke up and sank quickly, too quickly for the crew to launch lifeboats or send distress signals. The ocean, deep and vast, swallowed the wreckage completely. What we're left with is the largest unsolved mystery in U.S. naval history. 309 men sailed into the Atlantic on a cold March day in 1918 and simply disappeared. Fathers, brothers, sons, husbands. They never came home. Their families received no bodies to bury, no definitive explanation of what happened, no closure. The Navy conducted investigations for years, following up on alleged sightings, rumors of survivors, and conspiracy theories, but never found answers. She was called the most beautiful ship on the Australia run. A brand new luxury liner, 500 feet long, built to the highest standards of Edwardian maritime engineering. The SS Waratah was designed to carry passengers in comfort between Britain and Australia, offering amenities that rivaled the finest hotels. She had electric lights, luxurious cabins, spacious dining rooms, and all the modern conveniences of 1909. The ship was named after Australia's official floral emblem, the Waratah flower, and she represented the optimism and progress of the age. The Waratah completed her maiden voyage successfully in late 1908, traveling from London to Australia and back without incident. She earned praise from passengers for her comfort and service. Everything suggested she would have a long, successful career. In April 1909, she departed London on what would be her second and final voyage. The outbound journey to Australia was uneventful. The Waratah arrived in Adelaide, then continued to Sydney and Melbourne, picking up passengers for the return voyage to London. In Melbourne, however, something unusual happened. A passenger named Claude Sawyer, who'd made the outbound journey from London, refused to continue on the return trip. He disembarked, telling anyone who would listen that he'd had terrible nightmares about the ship and felt convinced she was unsafe. In his dreams, he said, he'd seen a man in a bloody shroud warning him, and he'd felt the ship rolling heavily in ways that seemed dangerous. Sawyer's concerns were dismissed by most as the nervous imaginings of an anxious passenger. The Waratah was new, well-built, and had performed perfectly on her maiden voyage. There was no rational reason to doubt her seaworthiness. But Sawyer was so convinced of impending disaster that he paid the financial penalty of breaking his contract and booked passage on a different ship. This decision would save his life. The Waratah departed Sydney on July 7, 1909, heading for Cape Town, South Africa. She carried 211 people, 92 passengers, and 119 crew members. The passenger list included families, businessmen, emigrants, and crew members from various nations. Captain Joshua Ilbery, an experienced officer with decades at sea, commanded the ship. Everything seemed normal as the Waratah steamed into the Indian Ocean. On July 26th, the Waratah passed the Clan McIntyre, another ship traveling in the opposite direction near the South African coast. The two vessels exchanged signals and greetings. The Clan McIntyre reported that the Waratah appeared to be in normal condition, sailing steadily, showing no signs of distress. This was the last confirmed sighting of the ship by any reliable witness. The next day, July 27th, another ship, the Harlow, reported passing what might have been the Waratah during the night. The captain of the Harlow saw navigation lights that could have belonged to the passenger liner, though he couldn't be certain. That was the last possible sighting. After July 27, 1909, the SS Waratah simply vanished. The ship was due to arrive in Cape Town on July 29th. When she failed to appear, authorities initially assumed she'd been delayed by weather or mechanical problems. But as hours turned to days with no word, alarm grew. The Waratah had radio equipment, though its range was limited. She should have been able to signal any problems once she came close to the South African coast. The complete silence was ominous. Search operations began quickly, growing into one of the most extensive maritime searches conducted up to that time. Ships crisscrossed the route the Waratah should have taken. Aircraft, still a very new technology in 1909, were eventually employed. Coastal watches were established. Divers examined underwater areas near the coast. The search continued for months, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no bodies, no debris. The Waratah had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The mystery of what happened to the Waratah has puzzled investigators for over a century. Let's examine the theories, starting with the most straightforward and moving toward the more speculative. The capsizing theory is the most widely accepted explanation. Several factors suggest the Waratah might have had stability problems that made her vulnerable to capsizing in heavy seas. During her maiden voyage, some passengers and crew had noticed that she rolled heavily, more than seemed normal for a ship of her size and design. The ship's top-heavy design, with passenger accommodations in tall superstructures above the main deck, might have raised her center of gravity, making her less stable than she should have been. The loading of the ship might have contributed to instability problems. On this final voyage, the Waratah was carrying a mixed cargo that included heavy items like lead concentrates in the lower holds. If this cargo shifted during rough seas, it could have destabilized the ship catastrophically. Once a ship begins to roll past a certain angle, physics takes over and recovery becomes impossible. The ship continues rolling until she capsizes, often sinking within minutes. Weather records from late July 1909 show that severe storms moved through the area where the Waratah should have been. These weren't ordinary storms. They were described as particularly violent, with enormous waves and winds strong enough to threaten even large ships. If the Waratah encountered these storms with inherent stability problems, she might have capsized quickly. A rapid capsize would explain the lack of distress signals and the absence of survivors or wreckage. The absence of any debris is actually not as mysterious as it might seem. The ocean off South Africa is deep, with powerful currents. A ship that sank rapidly in deep water might leave no surface debris, especially if most materials sank with the vessel. Wooden items that might normally float could have been carried away by currents and scattered across vast areas, or they might have become waterlogged and sunk. The search, while extensive, couldn't cover every possible area the wreckage might have drifted to. Some researchers have proposed that an encounter with a rogue wave might have doomed the Waratah. These enormous, unexpected waves can reach heights of 80 or even 100 feet, appearing suddenly in otherwise manageable seas. A rogue wave striking a ship with stability problems could have capsized her instantly, giving the crew no time to send distress signals or launch lifeboats. The ship would have simply rolled over and sunk. The explosion theory suggests that something in the cargo, perhaps the lead concentrates or other materials, might have exploded or caught fire, causing catastrophic damage that sank the ship quickly. But there's no evidence of explosion, no reports of fire or smoke from other ships in the area, and no logical explanation for what would have caused such an explosion. More mysterious theories emerged over the years, fueled partly by the complete absence of evidence. Some people reported seeing what they claimed was the Waratah, battered and listing, in the days after her disappearance. These alleged sightings were never confirmed and were likely cases of mistaken identity. People seeing what they expected or hoped to see. Decades after the disappearance, some items allegedly from the Waratah were recovered from the ocean floor during various explorations and fishing operations. These items, brass fittings, pieces of wood, metal plates, were claimed by some to be from the missing liner, but none could be definitively linked to the ship. The ocean floor off South Africa is littered with wrecks from many ships lost over centuries, making positive identification difficult. Claude Sawyer, the passenger who'd refused to continue on the ship due to his nightmares, became something of a celebrity after the Waratah disappeared. His decision to leave the ship based on premonitions seemed prescient and supernatural. But skeptics pointed out that Sawyer never made specific predictions about when or how disaster would strike. He simply had a general feeling of unease. The fact that disaster did strike seemed to validate his instincts, but it might also have been coincidence. Ships did sink in 1909, and anyone nervous about sailing might have worried about several vessels, with at least one likely to meet with misfortune. The Waratah inquiry, conducted by British authorities, heard testimony from numerous experts, passengers from her maiden voyage, and crew members who'd sailed on her previously. The inquiry couldn't reach a definitive conclusion about what happened. They noted concerns about her stability and acknowledged that she might have capsized in heavy weather, but they couldn't prove this without wreckage or survivors. The Waratah was declared lost with all hands, but the mystery of her fate remained unresolved. What makes the Waratah disappearance particularly poignant is that it occurred just 3 years before the Titanic disaster. Both ships were beautiful passenger liners representing the height of Edwardian maritime technology. Both sank on their early voyages. Both took all or nearly all their passengers and crew with them. But while the Titanic's fate is well documented, with survivors, wreckage, and extensive investigation, the Waratah left nothing but questions. The families of the 211 people aboard the Waratah faced the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what happened. There were no bodies to bury, no definitive explanation to accept, no closure. Some families held out hope for years that their loved ones might somehow have survived, might be stranded on an island somewhere, might someday return. But no one from the Waratah was ever found. Modern researchers using advanced technology have attempted to locate the wreckage of the Waratah on the ocean floor off South Africa. Several expeditions have explored promising sonar contacts, investigating what might be the missing ship. So far, none have definitively located her. The ocean floor in that region is complex, with many wrecks, rock formations, and debris fields that can create confusing sonar images. The Waratah might be down there, broken apart and scattered, or she might be in water too deep for current technology to easily explore. Sometimes the most haunting maritime mysteries aren't about what happened to a ship, but what happened to the person aboard. In July 1969, the trimaran Teignmouth Electron was found drifting in the Atlantic Ocean, her sails neatly furled, her cabin orderly, her supplies intact. But her captain, Donald Crowhurst, was gone. What makes this disappearance so haunting isn't the mystery of where he went. It's that his meticulously kept logbooks tell us exactly what happened to his mind in the months before he vanished. This is a story about ambition, deception, isolation, and the terrible weight of lies. The story begins not with a disappearance, but with a dream. In 1968, the Sunday Times newspaper announced the Golden Globe race, the first non-stop, single-handed round-the-world yacht race. 9 sailors would compete for 2 prizes, one for the first to complete the circumnavigation and one for the fastest time. It was to be the ultimate test of sailing skill, endurance, and mental fortitude. Donald Crowhurst, a 36-year-old businessman and amateur sailor from Devon, England, saw this race as his chance to solve all his problems. Crowhurst was struggling financially. His business, which manufactured electronic navigation devices, was failing. He had a wife and 4 young children depending on him. He was a dreamer, an inventor, someone who always believed the next big idea would turn everything around. The race offered prize money and, more importantly, the kind of publicity that could save his business. If he could win or even just complete the race successfully, his navigation equipment would gain international recognition. He could demonstrate his devices worked under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Everything would be fixed. There was just one problem. Donald Crowhurst wasn't really qualified for this race. He was an enthusiastic amateur sailor, but he'd never undertaken anything remotely approaching a solo circumnavigation of the globe. He'd never sailed in truly dangerous waters. He'd never tested himself against the Southern Ocean, where waves the size of buildings roll endlessly around the bottom of the world. But Crowhurst was convinced he could do it. He just needed the right boat and equipment. With time running short before the race deadline, Crowhurst commissioned a trimaran, a 3-hulled boat that should have been fast but was rushed through construction. The Teignmouth Electron was built in just a few months, far too quickly for proper testing and refinement. When Crowhurst departed from Teignmouth, Devon, on October 31, 1968, the boat wasn't truly ready. Equipment was incomplete, systems were untested, and Crowhurst himself was unprepared for what lay ahead. The race rules required participants to maintain radio contact and report their positions regularly. For the first few weeks, Crowhurst's reports suggested he was making reasonable progress, sailing south toward the Atlantic. But something was wrong. The boat was slower than expected, plagued by equipment failures. Water leaked into the hulls. The generator didn't work properly. Systems that should have been tested and perfected before departure were failing in the harsh ocean environment. By December, Crowhurst faced a terrible choice. He could continue south toward the Southern Ocean, knowing his boat wasn't seaworthy enough to survive those conditions. This would likely mean death. Or he could turn back and admit failure, which would mean financial ruin, public humiliation, and the loss of everything he'd staked on this venture. His business had already borrowed heavily against his success. Turning back would destroy him. Crowhurst chose a third option, deception. He would pretend to continue racing while actually remaining in the South Atlantic, sailing in circles, waiting for enough time to pass that he could return from a circumnavigation and claim a completion prize, if not an outright win. He would fake his position reports, maintain the illusion of a successful race, and hope no one would examine his records too closely. This decision required Crowhurst to maintain two sets of logbooks. One was the genuine log, recording his actual position and movements as he sailed aimlessly in the South Atlantic. The other was a false log, carefully constructed to show a plausible route around the world, with navigation calculations, weather observations, and daily entries that would convince race officials he'd actually made the circumnavigation. The creation and maintenance of this elaborate deception required enormous mental effort and constant anxiety about being discovered. As the months passed, Crowhurst's radio messages continued to report positions that suggested he was making his way around the world. Race organizers back in England were following his supposed progress with interest. His sponsors were pleased. His wife Claire and their children waited at home, believing Donald was actually accomplishing this incredible feat. But alone on the Teignmouth Electron, Crowhurst was coming apart. The isolation, the guilt of the deception, the constant mental effort of maintaining the false narrative, the knowledge that he was lying to everyone he cared about, it was destroying him psychologically. His logbooks from this period show a man descending into confusion and despair. By June 1969, other racers had completed the course or retired. Crowhurst realized that if he finished his false circumnavigation, he might actually win the elapsed time prize. This created a new nightmare. Winning would mean close scrutiny of his logbooks and navigation records. Experts would examine every detail. They would discover the deception. He would be exposed not just as a failure, but as a fraud and a cheat. The humiliation would be complete. Crowhurst's final logbook entries are heartbreaking documents of a mind in crisis. He began writing philosophical musings, mathematical theories, and increasingly incoherent thoughts about the nature of reality, God, and existence. The entries become harder to follow, jumping between topics, mixing navigation notes with metaphysical speculation. He wrote about being caught between two worlds, unable to go forward or back, trapped in a situation with no good outcome. His final entries, written on July 1, 1969, show complete psychological disintegration. He wrote about cosmic forces, about systems and games, about the nature of truth and deception. The handwriting becomes erratic, the thoughts are fragmented. And then, calculated to the minute, he wrote his final entry at 11:20 a.m. It is finished. It is finished. It is the mercy. On July 10, 1969, the Royal Mail vessel Picardy spotted the Teignmouth Electron drifting in the Atlantic, roughly 1,800 miles, southwest of England. When they boarded the abandoned trimaran, they found everything in surprisingly good order. The boat was seaworthy. There were supplies aboard, the cabin was neat, but Donald Crowhurst was gone, and his logbooks told the terrible story of what had happened to him. The evidence suggested Crowhurst had stepped off the boat deliberately, probably during the night of July 1st, after writing his final entry. He had chosen to disappear into the ocean rather than face the exposure of his deception. His body was never recovered. When the true story emerged, it created a sensation. The press coverage was intense, examining every aspect of Crowhurst's journey and unraveling the elaborate deception he'd maintained for months. His wife Claire, who'd believed Donald was completing a heroic circumnavigation, learned that he'd been sailing in circles in the Atlantic, slowly losing his grip on reality. The children learned their father had died not as a hero, but as someone who tried to fake an achievement and couldn't live with the guilt. The Crowhurst case raises profound questions about pressure, ambition, and the limits of human endurance. Donald Crowhurst wasn't a villain. He was a man who made a desperate decision when faced with seemingly impossible choices, then found himself trapped by that decision. The months alone on the ocean, maintaining an elaborate lie while knowing it would eventually be discovered, created unbearable psychological pressure. He couldn't go forward with the deception and face exposure. He couldn't turn back and admit what he'd done. So he chose a third option, to step off the boat and let the ocean take him. The isolation of solo ocean sailing can be psychologically devastating, even for well-prepared sailors making legitimate voyages. The human mind isn't designed for months of complete solitude, endless horizons, and the constant low-level danger of being alone on a small boat in vast waters. Many solo sailors report hallucinations, conversations with imaginary companions, and periods of mental confusion. For Crowhurst, already under the enormous stress of maintaining his deception and facing ruin if discovered, the isolation must have been unbearable. Modern sailors and psychologists have studied the Crowhurst case extensively. It's taught in sailing schools as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper preparation and the dangers of attempting voyages beyond one's capabilities. It's examined by psychologists interested in how isolation and guilt affect mental health. And it's remembered by maritime historians as one of the saddest stories of the sea. A man who didn't drown in a storm or die in an accident, but who was destroyed by his own deception and the crushing weight of being alone with an impossible secret. The Teignmouth Electron eventually made her way back to England and changed hands several times. For years, she was known as the Ghost Boat, the vessel that had witnessed Donald Crowhurst's psychological deterioration and final disappearance. She eventually fell into disrepair and was abandoned, becoming something of a memorial to a tragedy that happened not because of the ocean's violence, but because of its immense, indifferent loneliness. December 1812. America was at war with Britain, and the Atlantic coast was a dangerous place. British warships blockaded American ports, privateers and pirates operated with relative impunity, and winter storms made ocean travel treacherous. Into these dangerous waters sailed a small schooner called the Patriot, carrying one of early America's most fascinating women on what should have been a routine voyage from South Carolina to New York. Theodosia Burr Alston, daughter of former Vice President Aaron Burr, was traveling to reunite with her father after the death of her young son. She never arrived. Her disappearance would become one of American history's most enduring mysteries, linking early Republic politics with maritime tragedy. To understand why Theodosia's disappearance mattered so much, we need to understand who she was. Theodosia Burr Alston wasn't just the daughter of a famous political figure. She was exceptional in her own right. Her father, Aaron Burr, had overseen her education personally, giving her the same rigorous classical education typically reserved for men. By her teenage years, She was fluent in multiple languages, well-versed in literature and philosophy, and comfortable discussing politics and governance with the leading figures of the era. In 1801, when her father became vice president under Thomas Jefferson, Theodosia served as his hostess in the new capital of Washington. She was only 18, but handled the social and political demands of the position with remarkable grace. When she married Joseph Alston, a wealthy South Carolina planter who would later become governor, she continued to be involved in politics and intellectual life while managing a large household. But Theodosia's life was marked by tragedy. Her relationship with her father was extraordinarily close, perhaps the most important relationship in both their lives. When Aaron Burr's political career imploded after he killed Alexander Hamilton in their famous duel in 1804, and then faced treason charges after his mysterious expedition into the Western Territories, Theodosia stood by him. She visited him when others abandoned him, maintained correspondence, and used her social position to defend his reputation. By December 1812, Theodosia was 29 years old and had experienced even more loss. Her only child, a son named Aaron Burr Alston, had died of fever in June of that year. The loss devastated her. She became seriously ill herself, probably from a combination of grief and some physical ailment. Possibly malaria or another fever common in the South Carolina Low Country. Her father, Aaron Burr, now living in New York after years of exile in Europe, desperately wanted to see his daughter and help her through this terrible time. Theodosia's husband, Governor Alston, was torn. He didn't want her to travel in her weakened condition, but he also understood that seeing her father might help her recover emotionally. The journey from South Carolina to New York by sea was dangerous in winter, and especially so during wartime. British ships patrolled the coast, and pirates operated freely in the chaos of war. But Theodosia was determined to go, and her husband eventually agreed, securing passage for her on the Patriot, a small pilot schooner. The Patriot was a fast vessel, designed to outrun threats rather than fight them. Governor Alston arranged for his wife to travel with several companions and a crew experienced in coastal sailing. They departed Georgetown, South Carolina, on December 30, 1812, carrying a letter from the governor requesting safe passage, in case they were stopped by British or American vessels. The plan was to sail northward, staying relatively close to shore, and reach New York in perhaps a week if conditions were favorable. The Patriot never arrived in New York. Aaron Burr waited anxiously for word of his daughter's arrival. Days passed, then weeks. In early January, when a ship reported seeing debris that might have come from a small schooner off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, fears grew. By February, when still no word had come, the terrible truth became apparent. Theodosia and the Patriot were lost. The theories about what happened have multiplied over the more than 2 centuries since the disappearance. Some are plausible and supported by historical evidence. Others are romantic legends that reveal more about American mythology than historical truth. The most straightforward explanation involves weather. Late December and early January on the North Carolina coast can bring severe storms. Cape Hatteras, called the graveyard of the Atlantic, is one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the American coast, where the warm Gulf Stream meets cold northern currents, creating unpredictable and violent weather. A winter storm could have overwhelmed the small Patriot, causing her to sink quickly with all hands. Supporting this theory is the report of debris found off Cape Hatteras, though it was never definitively identified as coming from the Patriot. The timing fits. A ship leaving South Carolina on December 30th would have been passing Cape Hatteras around the time severe weather was reported in the area. If the Patriot encountered a sudden storm, perhaps at night, she might have sunk before the crew could launch boats or signal for help. Theodosia, already weakened by illness, would have had little chance of survival even if she'd made it off the sinking vessel. The piracy theory has more dramatic appeal and some historical support. The waters off the Carolinas were known to be frequented by pirates and privateers during the War of 1812. These weren't the romanticized pirates of Caribbean legend, but desperate, often brutal criminals who preyed on shipping. If pirates had boarded the Patriot, they might have killed everyone aboard to prevent witnesses, then scuttled the vessel to hide evidence. Several alleged deathbed confessions over the years claimed involvement in the Patriot's capture and the murder of its passengers. In the 1820s, a pirate awaiting execution supposedly confessed to being part of a crew that took the Patriot, killed everyone aboard, and sank her. In the 1830s, another dying man claimed to have been involved in a similar attack. However, these confessions couldn't be verified, and both may have been fabricated or confused with other incidents. The most famous alleged evidence of piracy emerged in 1869, over 50 years after Theodosia's disappearance. Dr. William Poole of North Carolina reported that an elderly woman in the Nag's Head area named Old Polly had, before her death, shown him a portrait of a young woman. Old Polly claimed this portrait had been taken from a ship that had been lured ashore and looted by wreckers, people who deliberately caused shipwrecks to steal cargo. She said the portrait had belonged to a beautiful, dying woman who was either killed or died shortly after the wreck. The portrait supposedly resembled Theodosia Burr Alston, and this story became part of the legend. However, the portrait's current location is unknown, and there's no way to verify whether it actually depicted Theodosia or came from the Patriot. The story has all the elements of a romantic legend: the beautiful tragic figure, the deathbed revelation, the mysterious portrait. It might contain a grain of truth, or it might be entirely fictional. Another theory involves the Patriot being captured by British warships blockading the American coast. Despite the safe passage letter Governor Alston had provided, British commanders might not have honored it, especially if they suspected the vessel of being a privateer or carrying valuable cargo. However, British naval records from the period don't mention capturing or sinking the Patriot, and taking the daughter of a former American vice president prisoner would have been significant enough to be documented. The Karankawa connection represents one of the stranger elements of the Theodosia legend. In the 1840s, a woman living with the Karankawa people along the Texas coast claimed to be Theodosia Burr Alston. She said she'd survived a shipwreck, been taken in by Native Americans, and had lived among them for decades. However, investigators who examined her claims found inconsistencies and doubted her story. The woman couldn't provide details about Theodosia's life that wouldn't have been publicly known, and her account of the shipwreck didn't match the timeline of the Patriot's disappearance. What makes Theodosia's disappearance particularly poignant is her father's grief. Aaron Burr, who'd survived political disgrace, years of exile, financial ruin, and public hatred, was completely undone by the loss of his daughter. His later letters and diaries show a man who never recovered from not knowing what happened to her. He died in 1836, having spent the last 24 years of his life without answers about Theodosia's fate. The mystery of the Patriot represents something profound about early American history. This was a time when even prominent people could simply disappear, when ocean travel was genuinely dangerous, when war and piracy made coastal waters treacherous. The country was young, communication was slow, and record-keeping was incomplete. Someone as notable as Theodosia Burr Alston could vanish, and despite inquiries, searches, and decades of speculation, no one could determine what happened. Modern historians generally believe the most likely explanation is the simplest. The Patriot encountered severe weather off Cape Hatteras and sank with all hands. The reported debris, the timing, the known dangers of that stretch of coast all support this theory. The confessions about piracy might have been fabricated by people seeking attention or confused memories of other incidents. The romantic legends probably grew from the very human desire to give a tragic story a more interesting ending than simple drowning in a storm. Theodosia Burr Alston was likely never the captive of pirates or the survivor living among Native Americans. She probably died in December 1812 or early January 1813, somewhere off the North Carolina coast, when a winter storm overwhelmed a small schooner carrying her toward a reunion with her father that would never happen. The ocean took her, as it had taken so many others, leaving behind only questions, legends, and the grief of a father who never stopped wondering what happened to his brilliant, beloved daughter. Our final mystery takes us into the 21st century, proving that even in our modern age of GPS, satellite communications, and constant surveillance, the sea can still produce baffling disappearances. In February 2006, Italian Coast Guard vessels spotted something unusual drifting off the coast of Sardinia. A luxury motor yacht, immaculate and apparently abandoned, sailing in circles about 50 miles from shore. When they boarded the vessel, they found a scene that might have come from a maritime ghost story. Except this happened in the age of smartphones and internet connectivity. The yacht was approximately 65 feet long, a beautiful vessel clearly designed for comfort and extended cruising. She was named Belle Amica, Italian for beautiful friend, and she appeared to be in perfect condition. The engines weren't running, but she was drifting with wind and current. Her anchor wasn't deployed, she was simply there, alone on the Mediterranean. When Coast Guard officers explored the yacht, they found a scene that was both ordinary and deeply strange. The vessel was fully stocked with food, including fresh produce that hadn't spoiled. The refrigerator was working, containing provisions for extended cruising. Clothing hung in the cabins, suggesting the owners had been living aboard. Maps and navigation charts were laid out, marked with notations showing planned routes. Personal items, toiletries, books, electronics, were scattered throughout the yacht in the normal patterns of daily life. The dining table was set as if someone had been preparing for a meal. Coffee cups sat on counters. The yacht's tender, a small inflatable dinghy, was still secured on deck. Life jackets remained in their storage areas. All the safety equipment was present and accounted for. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage that would suggest violence or accident. The Belle Amica looked like her crew had simply stepped off for a moment and would return at any minute. But the most puzzling detail was what the Coast Guard found when they examined the yacht's registration and documentation. The boat was registered to a Luxembourg company, but attempts to contact the owners went nowhere. The registration information led to addresses that didn't exist or to companies that couldn't be located. The French and Luxembourg flags flying from the vessel suggested international ownership, but neither French nor Luxembourg authorities could identify who owned the yacht or who might have been aboard. Personal documents found on the yacht included papers with French and Luxembourg addresses, but when investigators followed up, they found the addresses didn't exist or led to buildings that had no connection to the Belle Amica. It was as if the yacht's owners had deliberately created false information to obscure their identities. The investigation grew more mysterious as it progressed. The yacht itself was examined in detail. It was well-maintained and relatively new, worth several €100,000. The registration numbers and identification plates matched no known stolen vessels. The electronics aboard were functional. The yacht's logs and papers seemed genuine, but led nowhere when investigators tried to verify the information. Forensic teams examined the vessel for any signs of what might have happened. They found no evidence of violence. DNA samples were collected from personal items, but without names or suspects to compare them to, this evidence was useless. Fingerprints were lifted, photographed, and entered into databases, but yielded no matches. It was as if the people who'd owned and sailed the Belle Amica had never officially existed. The theories about what happened ranged from the criminal to the tragic. The most obvious suggestion was that the Belle Amica had been used for smuggling. The Mediterranean is a major route for smuggling operations, moving everything from drugs to weapons to human beings across borders. Perhaps the yacht had been involved in such an operation, and something had gone wrong. The crew might have abandoned the vessel to avoid arrest, or they might have been killed by associates in a deal gone bad. This theory would explain the false documentation and the untraceable ownership. Criminal enterprises don't register their vessels under real names or legitimate addresses. The yacht being found near Sardinia, a known waypoint for Mediterranean smuggling routes, supported this possibility. But if it was a smuggling operation, what cargo had been aboard? Coast Guard investigators found no evidence of drugs, weapons, or contraband. The yacht appeared to have been used simply as a private vessel. Another possibility involved human trafficking. Mediterranean waters see considerable illegal immigration, with people paying smugglers for passage to Europe. Perhaps the Belle Amica had been used to transport people, and something went wrong. The passengers and crew abandoned the vessel for reasons unknown, or tragedy struck and everyone went into the water. But again, there was no evidence of this. No signs that numerous people had been packed aboard, no documents or personal items suggesting passengers beyond a small crew. The accidental abandonment theory proposed that the yacht's crew had some kind of emergency. Perhaps someone fell overboard, or they saw another vessel in distress. That caused them to leave in the tender or be rescued by another boat. They might have intended to return, but were prevented by weather, accident, or other circumstances. The yacht then drifted until found by the Coast Guard. But this doesn't explain the false registration and untraceable ownership. If legitimate yacht owners had an emergency that forced them to abandon their vessel, they would have reported it. They would have claimed their property once it was recovered. The complete silence from anyone claiming to own or know about the Belle Amica suggests the owners had reasons not to come forward. A more sinister theory involves murder or crime that occurred aboard the yacht, with the perpetrators fleeing and leaving the vessel to drift. Perhaps a violent crime was committed, the victims' bodies disposed of at sea, and the criminals escaped in the tender or were picked up by an accomplice vessel. This would explain the abandonment and the lack of anyone claiming the yacht. But again, forensic examination found no evidence of violence. The question of how the Belle Amica ended up circling off Sardinia without a crew is actually the least mysterious part of the case. Modern yachts have autopilot systems that can maintain course and speed without human intervention. If the crew had set the autopilot, then abandoned the vessel for whatever reason, the yacht could have continued sailing in programmed patterns for some time. When the autopilot eventually lost power or malfunctioned, the yacht would have drifted with wind and current, which is how the Coast Guard found her. What makes this case particularly frustrating for investigators is how thoroughly the owners covered their tracks. In the age of digital records, international databases, and interconnected systems, it should be almost impossible to own and operate a yacht without leaving traceable documentation. Yet whoever owned the Belle Amica managed to do exactly that. They created a paper trail that appeared legitimate but led nowhere when examined. This level of deliberate obscurity suggests sophisticated planning, possibly by people with experience in creating false identities and documentation. After the investigation concluded, without identifying owners or determining what happened, Italian authorities faced a problem. What to do with an abandoned yacht no one claimed? The Belle Amica was eventually sold at auction, the proceeds going to the Italian state. The new owner, presumably, uses her for legitimate purposes, untroubled by whatever mysteries surrounded her previous incarnation. But the questions remain unanswered. Who owned the Belle Amica? Where did they come from? What were they doing on the Mediterranean in February 2006? What happened that caused them to abandon a valuable yacht fully stocked and in perfect condition? Why did no one ever come forward to claim the vessel or explain what happened? The Bell Amica case represents a peculiarly modern maritime mystery. In an earlier era, it wouldn't have seemed so strange for a ship to be found abandoned with unclear ownership. But in 2006, with registration databases, satellite tracking, digital communications, and international law enforcement cooperation, it seemed impossible that a luxury yacht could simply appear with no traceable history and no one claiming to own it. The case also highlights how the sea remains a place where people can disappear, even today. Whatever happened aboard the Bell Amica occurred away from surveillance, away from witnesses, in the vast open waters where ships pass without leaving traces. The Mediterranean, despite being one of the world's most traveled bodies of water, still offers enough privacy for mysteries to unfold unobserved. Unlike historical maritime mysteries, where the lack of evidence can be attributed to primitive communication technology and incomplete record-keeping, the Bell Amica case has no such excuse. This happened in living memory in modern times with all our technological capabilities. Yet we know essentially nothing about what happened. The beautiful yacht sailed out of nowhere, circled off Sardinia, and was found abandoned. The people who owned her, sailed her, and lived aboard her have never been identified and have never come forward. Tonight, we've sailed together through 2 centuries of maritime mysteries. From the 5-masted schooner found abandoned off North Carolina to the luxury yacht that appeared from nowhere in the Mediterranean. What these mysteries share, beyond their maritime setting, is a reminder of something profound. The ocean remains vast, powerful, and capable of keeping secrets, even in our modern age of constant communication and technological surveillance. Ships still disappear, people still vanish. Questions still remain unanswered despite our best efforts to solve them. The sea gives up some of its dead, some of its wrecks, some of its stories, but not all of them. Some mysteries remain locked in the deep waters, in the hearts of survivors who never speak, or in the final moments of those who disappeared, taking their answers with them into silence. Thank you for joining me on this journey across the world's mysterious waters, through fog and storm and calm seas that concealed tragedy. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may your own voyages be safe, may your anchors hold fast, and may the mysteries you encounter be the kind that invite wonder rather than sorrow.